Would you please pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Someone in the last week or two said something to the effect of, Pastor, you're always preaching on the Gospels. We're always talking about the Gospels, and that's good. And so when someone says something like that to me, that always makes me think in my head, let's do something different. Usually I curb that enthusiasm, but today I did not. Let's talk about Deuteronomy. Let's dig into the Old Testament. It is a beautiful day for Israel. The people are psyched. They've been waiting for this moment their whole lives. In fact, they've been waiting many lives for this moment, many generations of lives. The parents had longed for this moment. Their grandparents had longed for this moment. Their great-grandparents had longed for this moment. Many generations of grandparents and greats had waited for this moment. They were about to cross the River Jordan and inherit a new land that would be all they ever hoped for. But before that moment happened, they had to have some final instructions from God given through Moses. Of course, the story of Deuteronomy 30 starts much farther back than just Deuteronomy even. To get to this moment of joy and elation, one must begin with the remembrance of terror, of horror, and death. The story, of course, begins in Egypt. We could start much farther back, but this is only a 10 to 15-minute sermon, so we'll go back to Egypt. All of the people of Israel, God's people, were enslaved by the Egyptians in Egypt. At some places in history, slavery has been a tolerable thing for the enslaved, even romanticized by both the captee and the captor sometimes. Not here, though. Egypt was awful. In Egypt, there was nothing positive to say about that moment. Every day, the people of Israel were tasked with creating bricks and building monuments to Pharaoh. They picked the straw. They created the mud. They stomped the mud and straw. They'd build the brick molds and build the bricks. They'd carry the bricks to the locations where they'd build the monuments. Then they indeed did build the monuments and buildings to Pharaoh. They had terrible housing, barely enough food, worked in sweltering heat. Apparently it is very hot in Egypt. And the Egyptians, on the other hand, played the role of taskmaster and enforcer. Often the men of Israel were beaten to death for not working hard enough. Often men of Israel died because the task was too demanding for their bodies. Often the men of Israel wished they were literally dead rather than living lives of death. The story goes, though, that the good Lord heard the cries of his people in Egypt. And so God sent a man named Moses to be their freedom. And so Moses, backed with the power of the Lord, went before the Pharaoh. And after many days of discussion and miraculous works by the Lord, the people were freed. Of course, Pharaoh didn't let them go easily. After a couple of days of allowing his free labor force to escape, he changed his mind and went after them again. And once again, God's power shone through and saved the Israelites through the Red Sea. So finally, all the people reached this famed mountain called Sinai. And once there, Moses tells the people to be calm and patient as he goes up the mountain to talk with God. On the mountain, God speaks with Moses and gives Moses the entirety of the law. Or at least that's how it would be known throughout all generations. Every time you read in your scriptures the law, that's this stuff that God gave to Moses. And the law was simply the instructions on how the people of Israel would stand apart from the rest of the world. Not so that they could stand apart, but so that they could be light to the rest of the world. Some of the laws were rules about how they ought to live in relationship with each other and God. Other parts of the law were a moral code, or sort of moral statements. And still other parts of the law were instructions on how they ought to worship and how they ought to set up their worship spaces in their synagogues and temples. The law was a gift to them. It allowed them to know what it was that God hoped for them so that they could do right by God. The law became the most important thing in their world. However, they still had no land to call their own. They had no home. And it was not time yet to inherit the promised land, this land that God had been telling them all about. It would be a land of milk and honey, and they'd have all that they needed in this promised land. All would be good, and they would be happy and content. However, they were forced to wait for a generation until they could inherit that land. And so they wandered in the wilderness, the story says, both literally and I think figuratively. Well, finally, the moment indeed came for them to inherit the promised land, to enter in and have it as their own. And this brings us to our reading for today. Now, to be clear, if you pull out your book of Deuteronomy later because you are so enthralled with this story, there's a lot more to it than just our few verses for today. And so Moses, in our story for today, as he often did, speaks these words on behalf of God. Now, when I read these words this week, numerous times, I wondered to myself if these ancient Israelite people from so many millennia ago, I mean, we're talking 4,000 years ago this takes place, I wondered if they heard these words from Moses or from God through Moses the same way that we wind up hearing them today, all these years later. I mean, think about it from their perspective. Given that history, that story that I just shared about them, God was pretty much the God of love and compassion and freedom and devotion and miraculous mercy for these people, right? Isn't that who God would have been in the midst of this story? They went from being completely in bondage to being killed by their slave masters. And now, just a few generations later, they're about to enter into the promised land, this place of lush generosity and gracefulness. They had to have imagined that God could not be any better in their world. And so I imagine that they would have heard these words that we just heard from Kim a few minutes ago with a certain hopefulness and joy. I think they would have heard them as instructions and that evoked a love and thankfulness for God. I think these words would have made them feel confident in God's love and care and determined for their life together with each other and with their God that loves them so much. And then I thought about how we probably read these words 3,500 years later than when they were written or offered up. I don't think we hear these words with all that goodness around them. I think we are inclined to hear these words as warning. Perhaps we even hear these words as threats. Our negatively oriented minds probably start with the first sentence and go negative. You know, these words, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. And then, a little later on, Moses says, if you obey the commandments of the Lord, the law that is, if you obey the commandments of the Lord, you shall live and become numerous. But if your heart turns away, you do not hear, you shall perish, and you shall not live long in the land that you are crossing Jordan to possess. Right? That's threatening stuff. Gloom and doom, God's going to crush them if they do the wrong thing. Aren't we inclined to hear these words as threats or warnings or something along those lines? I find that we Christians are just overwhelmingly inclined to read through passages like this and so many others in the Scriptures under the pretense of fear and threats. I feel like we do this all the time. I feel like it's just our natural tendency when reading the Scriptures to read them through the lens of God hates us. I mean, sometimes it may be appropriate. There might be some places where that was the intentionality, but often we just get bogged down in this place of threats and fear at ridiculous levels. I mean, do we really think that the God of the Scriptures, this God who offers to come and actually live with us in the New Testament, do we think that that God is angry and fear-mongering? That it's like waiting for the opportunities to jump on us and crush us? Like, oh, you broke the law, coming down on you. Do we really think that's the nature of God? I don't know what your answer is, but I will give mine. And I don't give a lot of certitude from this place, but I do give this one on my behalf. I do not find God to be a God of fear-mongering or threat-mongering. I don't think our God is an angry God or one in which desires us to be connected to God via fear. So that means for me that every time I read through passages like this one from Deuteronomy, I stop myself if I think, ooh, God sounds really angry and kind of mad at his people there, fearful. I pause and I reread it so that I might try to understand it through the lens of a God who deeply loves me and all of us. These words of Deuteronomy are the perfect example, especially in light of the place in which they fall in this story, at the end of something that God has done that's miraculous for God's people. It is easy to read them with fear for us and trepidation, but aren't they really the words of not what God intends to do based on good or bad behavior, but aren't they really the words of how the world is when we live into it? Like when we live into the law, into the goodness that God has in mind for us, when we abide by strong moral code and care for each other, don't we find that life is good? That life is better? This isn't something I think that God miraculously imparts on us, or like when we do good things, God's out there to bless us with more good things. Because it doesn't work like that in my experience. And conversely, when we make bad decisions, when we break relationship with each other and with God, when we step all over the law that God has given us, don't we find that life pretty much is terrible? It's pretty miserable for us. It's miserable when we're with each other. These words aren't threats. They aren't fear-mongering by God, but God's not waiting for us to step on the wrong thing and break the code so that God can bring the ban hammer down on us. God's waiting to love us. These words are simply instruction of how it is in this world that God has given us. When we love each other, when we care for the world and each other, as God has already done for us, we can expect life to be better for us. And when we don't, we know life is more of a struggle. And so when we read these words from Deuteronomy, there is an invitation before us to live into this tradition of our ancient Israelite ancestors that have known the love of God to be the thing that has brought them from the worst of worst. And to read these words with the love and affection of a parent that says, do these things and life will be good for you. And I'll love you in the midst of all them. And we are invited to choose the law, to follow God's invitation to us of love and compassion. Amen.